All right. Welcome, Jenn. It's good to have you with us.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
As I was sitting down to prepare for our conversation, I was just thinking back on kind of the timeline of our relationship, our
Hmm.
friendship. And the first time that we connected, I think was about 10 years ago. And I was leading a course called Reversing Our Curse about healing our cycles. And at that time, you were doing a lot around cycles. I remember your website at the time. There's a picture of you in a rowboat. Do you remember that? And the tagline, great tagline, it was success is a rhythm, not a race.
Yeah.
And I invited you in to be a guest teacher in that course. And I forget who introduced us, but some wonderful woman introduced us. And our paths have been crossing ever since. And we both have changed a lot. Our work has changed a lot. We've changed a lot. We've been through a lot in our lives. And I wanted to presence some of those pieces here in our conversation today.
Yeah. Yeah, it was Megan Watterson who connected us.
Megan Watterson, that's right. Yes. Thank you to Megan. So we both experienced archetypal, this is going to be redundant. We both had archetypal experiences of betrayal. And for those who are listening who have also had that experience, just the word itself has a reverberation through your being, and you know what that means on so many different levels. And Jen, I'm wondering if you can take us back to your moment or your first moments of betrayal in one of your most recent, or if not the most recent heartbreak experience, and share with us just whatever elements feel okay for you about what that experience was.
Yeah. It's funny you say the word betrayal, and it took me some time to even be able to say that word. And it was so obvious that it was betrayal. But when I would talk about what I was going through and say a therapist or a parent or a close friend would bring up like, well, it's betrayal. And I would just sit with it. I'm like, what does that even mean to be betrayed? But I'll talk about how I discovered that I was betrayed and bring you through a little bit about it, because for me it wasn't there was an intellectual reckoning of it, but it was pure betrayal in the sense that my entire psyche's somatic system, my whole body, like I couldn't even hold the content. It was that shocking to me. I was maybe 2 weeks before my deadline with Cosmic Health. So I was at that end point of any writer knows when you're writing a book that a couple weeks before you hit a deadline is a really big deal. And this was my first draft of my book going into my publisher. So it had been a long-winded writing process and so close to the end, but still so far away. Those last couple of weeks are just so critical to the writing process. And I was busy. I was just busy. I was in the thick of hitting this deadline. It was a big book, it was 100,000 words. The content was a little bit ambitious, and the writing process at times just felt completely overwhelming. And it was like the end of a really long marathon. And I was just that fatigued, tired. I just remember I couldn't really eat solid foods. Like I was at the point where in the writing process where I'm like, I can have pasta and butter. Like that's about all I can digest right now. There were some nights where sleep wasn't as productive as I needed it to be. Sometimes I was just up too late writing. So it was like at that level of fatigue. And at the time I was married, and my partner and I had two homes, one in the city and one upstate. And I had gone upstate, I had seen him in the city. We had just celebrated our 10-year wedding anniversary. So it was just a few weeks after our 10-year wedding anniversary. And I had, planned on being upstate for a little bit of time to just get clear on the remaining factors of this book. And he was going to come up on the weekend. And I remember it was a Friday night and I just had a panic attack. And there were many reasons for me to have had a panic attack. Panic attacks are not foreign to me. I do experience them from time to time. At one point in my life, they were frequent and severe. And so it had been a while since I had had a panic attack, but it wasn't an unknown experience. And, I called my dad. He's like, you need to go to the hospital. I'm like, I'm not going to the hospital. And I didn't really know what was going on. And it's just like, that heaving exhaustion and total overwhelm that one would experience when they're going through something as dramatic as a panic attack just was unrelenting. And I was on the phone with my mom very late at night because I couldn't sleep. And I was calling my husband, and he was really annoyed that I was calling him, like just bizarrely annoyed that I was like interrupting his night. He was out with friends, and it was making it worse. Like it was escalating it. So it was escalating over the course of the night, and my mom must have been like 2 or 3 in the morning. Thank God for moms who stay on phones with daughters when they're in those states through all hours of the night, as my mom did. And she just said, Jenn, he's cheating on you. And I'm like, what? Cheating on me? Like, it just was not even something I could even take in or understand. But lo and behold, I had him come up the next day, and he gave me some song and dance about how he wanted to go to therapy, but it wasn't to save our relationship. It was to talk about our relationship. Now, mind you, this is a man who, like, I just spent my 10-year wedding anniversary with. I had turned 40 that year. We'd gone to Paris. Like, for all intents and we were in, still in the process of trying to adopt a child to some degree. Like, we weren't actively trying, but it had been on the table, like in previous months due to like a kid who might have fit us. We ruled against it because it wasn't a choice we wanted to make, but we were still very much a couple and very much actively in our relationship. So just these words of he's not happy, he wants to go to therapy, and not to work on our relationship to save it, but to determine, what to do from here. Because in his mind, he had already resolved the fact that he wasn't happy. And it just was also shocking to me that I didn't just completely didn't understand what was going on. So we had gone to bed that night, and frankly, I'm not necessarily proud of this, but what happened next is that in the middle of the night, I got up and I'm like, what is going on? And I went and I opened his computer, and didn't have to hit anything or do anything. It was just his text messages were there because, you can get text messages to a computer. And I had seen the whole thing, who he was out with, the nature of their conversations, his intention of coming home. Like, and I had seen their whole, I get like, oh, just even talking about this now. So it wasn't like a deep snoop. It was an opening of a laptop that just hit me over the head with like a 2x4. And right then and there, I knew. And so, the next 24 hours were rough. And finally, I just called him on it. I was like, look, I know. And he, handled it in the way that he handled it. He went back to the city, and the next day immediately called me and told me, like, he had a lapse of consciousness or sanity. I forget how he said it, but he very much wanted to work on the relationship. So such a confusing experience to be blindsided by this information, to be treated with such disregard and disrespect, to be honest, and then have someone in the same breath several hours later retract everything and have a different frame of reference for how the experience was and what their intentions were with it. All while on a very important, tight deadline with a really important creative project. So it was bewildering. And this was fall of 2019. So, things globally were on edge and soon to be brought to a screeching halt. And I was in this very precarious place, in all aspects of my life, being body, soma, psyche. I mean, I never even had dreamed of a dream where I wasn't going to be with my husband. So I had no reference point for what any of this could potentially be or mean. And it was just devastating, to say the least.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this with us. And there's so much that I'm feeling right now hearing your story. Some pieces that are standing out that I want to highlight is one, thank goodness for your mom,
Right.
that clear seeing, and for her to just call that out and say that to you. I don't think that's common.
No.
And then also that impulse in you to get out of bed and check the computer. And I mean, you haven't read my book yet, but you'll see I had some experiences like that. I really relate to it. And I can say from my own experience that I'm not the kind of person who does that.
Mm.
But I just want to validate that for you, for me, for anyone listening, when you have that impulse to do it, and it usually does come in the middle of the night, that there's something to that. There's something like calling you to do that.
I've never, ever in the history of my relationship checked anything of his. Maybe like on his social media, like, oh, he got this post, this person commented. I don't know this person, click, like something like that. But never was I even remotely interested in his accounts or his email, anything like that. So I did think it was um, an interesting time to feel called to check. And boy, am I glad I did, because he was just going to run with the story that he wasn't happy. And, full disclosure, he blamed, as I think happens often, me. I'm not happy because you do this. And I'm like, well, you've never told me this. Like now that I hear this, let me work on it. What, this is manageable. Like, thanks for telling me. But I didn't realize that there was an ulterior motive, another relationship he was invested in. And without that information, I could have very well have just circled on a completely different topic for God knows how long, until I was like, this isn't working. Let's just break up. And then he would be gone with no accountability to what had happened. And let me also say, it wasn't even about accountability. The gift of having this all out in the open was the gift of being able to look at what it was. Like, affairs happen, like people get cheated on, not because of great judgment, not because of moral ethics, but because the erotic is what the erotic is, and it literally happens. And what I learned in the whole process is that once we could get past the magnitude of lies, and there were many more, it was really actually incredibly helpful for my healing journey to have it all on the table and to understand what had happened and to probe deeper into what was going on with him that prompted him to behave in these ways. And I know that that's not something many people who were betrayed or cheated on have any interest in doing, or maybe not even the bandwidth to do it, or maybe the other person's not capable of doing it. I mean, there's a million reasons to not do that. But I will say, for me in my journey, I'm really grateful and glad that I got the full picture. We were able to spend time with it on what the actual real life truths were. It did take sleuthing on my part. But once it was all out in the open, it was tremendously powerful for the both of us and for the sanctity of our marriage as we came to conclusion that it was over.
So it sounds like there was a lot of withholding for like a period of time before it all came to light. And you mentioned, know that you were in a really big work period and the home stretch of finishing that first draft of your book, which is enormous. But do you think that any elements of just what was happening with you, with your sleep, with your digestion, were related to the withholding, that any parts of you sense that something was happening? I don't want to project onto you, but I had that experience in retrospect. I realized that a lot of things that I was experiencing that I thought was work stress was actually stress related to betrayal that was happening.
It's interesting because I've sat with this question a lot, and it's an onion unto itself. Like, I am a very independent minded woman. I grew up with a single mom, and I've always had this just strong ethos around securing my own lane in life and partnering with someone who has their own lane in life. And then we have multiple lanes, but like a shared union. But what I realize in hindsight is that I'm not sure I ever felt safe in the marriage. And I think a lot of the pressure I put on myself professionally was driven by a deep inner knowing of fundamental insecurity in the dynamic. And so it's hard to say, was that stress then because of the book, or did I innately know, or was it compounded? Was it compounded long-term stress? Once I figured out the origins of the affair, it had been several years, and it wasn't like an active, ongoing affair that was day to day for several years. But the initial incident of it all had happened years prior, and it had been brushed under the carpet and then hit in these the frequency or the cadence of their communication, which was spread out. It wasn't, like I said, ongoing, but it was long term. And so I think I had been holding it for a while. And I think that it impacted my whole frame of reference for so long that it was hard to tell. I will say that I had deep loneliness, like profound loneliness. And I thought that it was because I couldn't have a child. And I was grappling with infertility and lack of child. But that loneliness hits right exactly precisely when he first betrayed the marriage years prior. And so what I thought was an inability to have a child and deep otherness in my own womanhood, given that I had had a hysterectomy so young, and just this quiet and the solitude of not having children in the backseat or babies to tend to. I was in my late 30s, and I had phantom callings to mother to like pick up children, and none of that was happening. And it was something I was grappling with. But through extensive psychotherapy, it was pointed out to me that that loneliness emerged basically to the day that he had cheated on me. And so I thought that that was really interesting, because loneliness is a deep stress, and it is such a pain, like an inner pain I can't even really describe. And that was tied to the betrayal for sure.
Yeah, it's good to hear you talk about that, because I can relate to that too, that in looking back on the relationship where I experienced betrayal, I could see how even from the very start, I never really felt safe. But to me at that time, that felt normal. And that, I mean, I guess we'll get to that, but that was part of my healing to do as well. Why was I with someone who I didn't feel safe with? But I also want to name that the heartbreak that you're mentioning with infertility and just that earlier heartbreak in your life. For listeners, we actually had a conversation about that on this podcast some years ago that I'll put a link to in the show notes if listeners want to listen to that particular conversation as well. So you find out that this betrayal comes to the surface. You're a week or 2 weeks out from your book deadline.
Mm-hmm.
My gosh. What did you do? How did you handle that?
I mean, it was rough. It was rough. I am really lucky that I wasn't so far off when this had happened. And I'm really lucky that the work I had produced up till this point was pretty quality. And so mostly I'm just grateful for the work ethic I had about the project in totality. But I just chopped wood and hauled water, so to speak. Like, I mean, there was some crying for sure, lots of it. There was a deep understanding that the book I had been writing was for this moment in my life. Like the book, I didn't know that, but the book, the content, the creation I was making spoke so fully to the experience I was having at that moment that there was an intersection between the two that was ultimately life-giving and supportive of the creative process. But yeah, when you're in the deep throes of trauma, like I was in at that time, I honestly don't even remember it. It was blinding. And I would say through the grace of the divine, that work was completed. And I realized that I was midwifing something that transcended my own intelligence. And I just tuned into that. And that saw me through the whole project, honestly, just taking a step back and being available for the information. Because I was certainly in the middle of an ego death myself.
Yeah. And then from there, what, like, if as you're looking back, what do you feel like were some key phases of your healing process that you moved through?
Well, to give you and your listeners the full breath, this happened in November of 2019. He and I didn't separate until January, like 1st of 2022. So is that correct? 20, was it 2020? Yeah, it was 2022. So we spent all of 20 and all of 21 in couples counseling. We lived together during the pandemic. Um, we weren't sure if we were saving our marriage, if we were terminating our marriage. That was the whole like goal for therapy, was like, what is the next right thing? We both went through phases and stages of, this is something we can work through, we just need a clean break. And it was intense relational dynamics. He there was more to the story. Like I had to figure out that this had started in 2016, and that he still, even in his confession, wasn't totally truthful. And there are other stories on how I figured all that out. But again, it was down to like just deep trusting of instincts, looking where I needed to look at the right time to get full breadth of story. So it took me maybe 3 months to get the whole story. And those 3 months were the worst 3 months I think I've ever lived through. Because I just felt wildly, I don't know, like just so much anxiety. That feeling of like, I didn't know I was being lied to, but I was still being lied to. And it was just absolutely horrific to live through that. My insecurity was just so high. Uh, and then by the time I got the full story, it was already locked down. So at that point, it was lockdown. And our apartment in New York City was like right in the epicenter of some extreme COVID activity. So it made no sense for us to stay separate. Um, so he came upstate and we started the pandemic. And long story short, I'm an astrologer, and I had known that that time was going to be difficult. I had known that in my own chart, I was going through a deep, dark night. I knew the time frames around all of this. They weren't short. Like sometimes in astrology, you can just see like there's a segment of time here that is going to be wildly transformative. I, again, thought and looked everywhere but in my marriage, which happens. Um, but when I realized like what it was and the length of time it was going to take, there was sort of a guidepost around that where I knew like, okay, decisions just aren't going to be made fast here. And there's a lot of work to be done on a personal level, on a relational dynamic level, on a professional level. So in some ways, I think, I felt grateful that I had some sort of concept of how long this was going to be, because it just helped me set my expectations. The state of the world was traumatic and crazy and so dark, that it was very easy to go down rabbit holes of despair at that time. Collectively, we were in a cycle of collective despair. But I remember, also being conscious about cultivating gratitude. I had a house over my head. I had a safe place to live. He and I were working through these really intense, deep issues, and we were doing it not well. I don't think anyone does that well, but well enough. Um, Um, but again, I was in a state of trauma, like just doing the best I could. Uh, I have deep spiritual practices. I think the work that you and I both do speaks so profoundly to Dark Mother and how to be in the center of the storm when all else fails, and to have some framework of what it means to grieve and grieve big and grieve devotionally, and how to set a life and a routine up around that, like, so I had my altar, I had, you know, my support system, I had my journal, I had my tissue box, I cried. I had to be present to some intense anger that was emerging from within. My erotic was like crazy because I was, I think one thing we don't talk about enough in the space of betrayal, and I think everybody is entirely different in how they go through this. So I'm not sure if I had experiences that are even relatable, but for me, I was straight up jealous that someone else was getting a part of my husband that was uniquely mine, or however that works. Nothing's yours, but in the context of a marriage, a sexual relationship is very intimate and private. And my erotic was like totally instigated by all this. So I had to contend with like those aspects of my physical being. I mean, it was a storm. Um, it took time. Like it just took time. And one thing I'll say is that the pandemic shut the world down. And had the pandemic not had happened, he and I would have never co-regulated in any way, shape, or form at this time, because I think otherwise it would have been completely impossible. But the fact that we were quarantined together, doing couples therapy via Zoom, and we had one good thing was is that we had a great couples therapist. We had found a great couples therapist prior to lockdown, and we had met with her a few times in Manhattan, and then she moved her practice online, so we were able to have her regularly, and it just was what it was. There was like this deep surrender to it. But the phases and the stages, there was his remorse, his regret, his writing of letters and deep sorrow and quest for forgiveness, my like just sitting with it, like I forgave him, and I know that that's hard for people to understand from certain perspectives as well. It's like, how could you? Someone lied to you, they betrayed you. um it just was genuine for me, like I could forgive him, but that didn't mean I wanted to stay married or continue to build a life with him. And so those were deep questions I had to sit with. And then there was the shame, the complete and total shame I felt, which, our couples therapist, my private therapist, they deeply challenged that because that shame wasn't mine, right? It was a shame that was upon the relationship in a way, but it wasn't like my shame. But in my body, my mind, my soul, it was my shame. So it was like sitting with that.
I think that shame is also cultural because
Yeah.
I really felt that too. I felt shame and humiliation.
Mm-hmm. No,
And I,
totally.
yeah, I remember one of the main women that my former fiance was sleeping with. Her best friend worked at this store in town that I love to go to normally, but I didn't want to go to the store because I didn't want to see her friend, her best friend, and feel that humiliation. And I remember my older sister was visiting maybe a couple months after I found everything out. And I told her about this store, and she's like, I'm going to go there with you so that you don't have to go there by yourself. And so you can just get it over with. And then you can keep going back to that store because you love it so much. And we went in there together. And I remember I was kind of shaking with how humiliated I felt. And even though I knew, like, why do I feel humiliated? I didn't do anything.
Exactly.
But
And
I really think it's cultural. It's like you look at the woman and it's like, what did she do? Or what's wrong with her? Or I don't even know what it is, but it just kind of gets put on the partner, especially if it's a woman partner.
well, and the stories, like after this, I'm like, I realize I'm not alone, that there's, you know, a partner who isn't faithful in the relationship and blames the other partner for why they weren't faithful. They weren't happy because the relationship looked like X, Y, and Z, and they needed ABC. Their needs weren't being met in this way. And so I think that all that's true though, like there are mismatches and dynamics, and there are preceding imprint, like things that lead to infidelity. Um, and they're important, right? To look at, like, what are the unmet needs in this dynamic? What led you to not come clean about this before whatever happened? Was it just an erotic act? Was there a deeper emotional betrayal? Like, all those questions are real and valid, and it's important to understand, at least for me, it was what the side of the story was. But there's also a smear campaign that happens with that. And that smear campaign is targeted at devaluing, dehumanizing, and creating a scapegoat, in the sense of this person being like deserving the betrayal. Like, you didn't deserve your betrayal. I didn't deserve my betrayal.
No one deserves it.
No one deserves their betrayal. But there's also like the scapegoating that happens, and that is psychological emotional abuse. And I certainly went through it. And I think that that was the repatterning. What the shame was that no matter how strong anyone is, when you go through a heartbreak like that and someone tells you they did it because you were this way and not that way, or there's corroborated evidence from other people in the community, or however fandangled these stories become and the momentum behind them gets, it's a lot to sort out. I mean, it is a ton to sort out. And, I think it's really common to just feel like I know in my situation, I personally failed at being with this person needed and created this dynamic. Totally not true, right? Like, none of it true, but I certainly went through those feelings and emotions. And let me just say also, I lost a lot at this time. Like, I lost friends. I lost a connection to my confidence. I lost, the innocence of my marriage. I lost my hope for the future. Then I actually went on to lose more. Like, I had a parent die of COVID. My dog died. It was just like the season of intense pain. But the losing of social connection outside of the marriage, from people that I had built tight personal relationships who weren't connected with my husband, who were exclusively my support system, that was brutal, and like that was brutal to go through that at the same time.
Yeah, I experienced that too. And that's one of the things I write about in the book is we have these initial heartbreaks, but then there's all these like subsequent heartbreaks, like dominoes that happen in relationship to that we don't often talk about or even acknowledge ourselves. But it has this compounding effect that is really, really challenging. So you're already going through a hard time, and then these core relationships fall away amongst, people, health challenges, people, have health challenges or financial challenges, or, hard time in their work, and just keeps compounding.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I lost friends I never in a million years thought that I thought we were ride or dies for life. But who I was before I went through this experience was different than who I was amid this experience, and certainly different who I am now. And I couldn't meet their needs anymore. And I didn't realize that they were such dimensional dynamics, or our friendship was conditional, or that I could do the wrong thing in the moment of grief to such an extent to like lose a friend. Um, But yeah, it happened. And it was just as hard as the loss of my marriage. Um, it was like I could literally cry sitting here talking about it now. Not that I need to, but it is like, damn, that shit's sorry, is just real. Like that happens
Yeah,
because in my mom, I was damaged goods, and like it's like a disease people don't want to catch. It's like it could be
exactly.
contagious. I don't know. It's like
Exactly.
contagious. I just am going through something I never possibly could have prepared myself for. Albeit now I realize I could have, but like at the time it was completely inconceivable to me. And I was grieving at such a profound level that it was alienating to some of the closest people in my inner circle.
Yeah.
And that's sad, but it happens and you get through it.
Yeah, that is one of the biggest challenges of heartbreak is how people get scared off by it. And usually people who haven't been through it to that extent because it's confronting, I think, for people or just don't know how they don't know how to relate to it. And also, like you said, there's also something else happening in that you're becoming a different person and things need to fall away that were connected to the old you that aren't in alignment with the new you, but it's doesn't make it any easier.
No, it was just the tower card in the tarot where it's like the towers are just going to come down, and it was like multiple towers all coming down at the same time. And now fast forward to we're near spring of 2024. My life is infinitely stronger, better, more centered, more grounded. The relationships I've built and continued through that time, because that's the other thing, like some of my friends, we've just gotten so tight and so close. And like my family dynamics have just infinitely healed. And the new people that have come into my life are amazing. And my relationship with me is, I don't recognize some of who I was before this. So everything does come back and come back better or stronger. But I also, one thing I will say is that I have complete and total empathy for anyone who's ever gone through something like this. And it takes as long as it takes, right? Like, there's no timeline on how quickly you bounce back from some of this. There's no timeline on if you bounce back from something like this. There's no timeline of how pretty you go. I was like watching Mrs. Maisel when I was going through this. I'm like, so this woman just had her husband cheat on her. She's left with two kids, and now she's like a rock star comedian. Like, how does this happen? Because like I was just the ugly cry for a good long time, and like I wasn't making anyone laugh, and there was no package to put it into. And I think that that's part of the story is like the rebound's got to be stronger than who you were before. Like, these ethos we have about what it means to be a strong woman who emerges. And it's like, this could take 10, 15 years. Like, I'm grateful that I got through it, in the extent of time I did. And then I can sit here and say, like, yeah, like I've been able to process this and I'm happy with where I am now. And, I have closure. Had some big losses along the way, some huge heartbreaks, but I got through it. Like, it doesn't have to look like that. Like, by the grace of the divine, for me, like, I'm here and I can say that, but like, this could have easily taken me infinitely longer. And I completely understand that it sometimes has to, it will, that you will be in that ostracized place for quite some time. And there is no pretty bow to wrap it up in until the pretty bow comes of its own merit, grace, timing, whatever that takes. And so I'm just in awe of anyone who's gone through any kind of betrayal, certainly women who've had, in the middle of raising a family with kids, certainly women who don't have independent sources of income separate from the marriage. There's a million ways that this could be way more complicated than what I personally faced. ultimately more abusive, and ultimately more isolating. So I just say that as a huge caveat that like there's no one way to go through this, and it just takes time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things that I reckon with in my healing process was, how did I miss this?
Mhm.
What was I not seeing? Or as I started to learn, because I also learned bit by bit over time what was happening. I still don't know the full picture, but I have a sense of it. I was able to look back and kind of put pieces together and kind of remap those several years of my life. And there was a deep atonement process with myself of and needing to forgive myself. What was that process like for you? Was that something that you relate to?
Yeah, so I work in health and wellness, and early in this, like maybe it must have been like a week after the initial understanding of the betrayal. Um, a friend arranged a conversation with Catherine Woodward Thomas for me to have. And so, I got on the phone with this woman who wrote Conscious Uncoupling and told her my story, and she gave me some fast feedback, and some really good benchmarks. But the one thing that stuck with me with her from her that conversation, I only talked to her once, but I did read her book and apply her principles to this process, is that it could be 98% their fault, like 99.9% their fault. But the one thing you are responsible for here is how you got into this, what you were ignoring, what was yours in this relationship to look at. And I took that very seriously. Um, and I think that this is an interesting conversation to have, because now the world, almost to the extent that anti-racism work was really a cultural zeitgeist, very necessary during the pandemic. We're in the cultural zeitgeist of understanding abusive relationships with disordered personalities, and just how complicated that is, and just understanding all these different terms that I personally just didn't know about, like being a narcissist abuse survivor, and looking at you know being on the receiving end of some of these tactics that are foul play all around. But even still, having identified some really below the belt tactics that were used against me that did leave me in a compromised place, there was a lot of atoning for me to do. And that was pretty much exclusively where I've focused and lived, since this had happened. And it is ongoing. I'm still in a process of atoning. I'm still in a process of rebuilding. I'm still in a process of making sense of who I was when I was 24, when I met my husband. I met him in the middle of January of 2004. It's the middle of, or the beginning of March 2024. So it was 20 years ago that I had met him. And just going back to who I was in my lifeline at that time, and understanding, going back to the me I was before I met him, right? Like going back to the me I was in the days, the weeks, the months, the years before I met him, and understanding my frame of reference from that point, and then gradually going through the relationship and just understanding the compromises I made along the way. Because I certainly made compromises. And, but there's also one other thing, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping all over the place, that I want to say is that the one thing that has happened is that, as much as I can say, like, okay, how did I get into this? How did I stay in this? What is really for me to learn in this situation? I also have complete and total peace in knowing that there was really no way I was going to do this different. Like, my life trajectory put me on this cosmic curriculum path with this other soul. We were together for a very long time. I know not as long as some marriages, but it was a substantial relationship. We were together for years and years before we got married. It's not like we just met and got married. And that was a fated destined part of my life. And I couldn't have been a different person with different awarenesses until I went through this process. So I think it is like I have atoned, I've also accepted. The atonement is ongoing. Uh, and that's really the fun part, I would say, like for me, is like I think that part is fun, is like understanding places I didn't even realize I was betraying myself or compromising my own core values and making corrections there. Because that means like I have new possibilities in my day-to-day life. I'm integrating aspects of myself that were not available to be integrated or cast aside at a certain time. That feels like a huge gain. Like that's just like waking up every day to a new present at this point. Like I'm just like, oh, this is me. This is what this is how I was doing things. This is what I really want. Like I feel great about this now. Um, I think the hardest part was the acceptance piece. It was just like accepting that this is part of the human path. We get our hearts broke. This is part of love.
And
Sometimes you
also,
get
I
the happy
appreciate you
ending.
saying like the fated aspect, how this is what happened. This is who you were. This is what happened. And I think that also brings in the element of the soul, that from the soul perspective, hardship and heartbreak aren't bad things. They're actually the core things that evolve us. I mean, I believe joy can evolve us too, but anyone who's been through really challenging things, which I think is pretty much everyone who's listening to this, you know that it's in the hardships that you grow the most. And that's how we evolve.
Exactly. And these things, like I I always am like, really grateful for people who don't go through experiences like this. Like, like that's awesome. Like that's amazing that like how powerful, how cool, what a great example. Um, and just because it's you, and I'm gonna pretend like everyone else isn't listening, I will say there's also this part of me in not in all dynamics, not even in some dynamics, but just like this healthy sense of like skepticism where I'm like, and it can still happen to you, like
Yes. And who
these,
will you be when that happens to you? How will you
yeah,
handle that when that happens to you?
it can still happen, like no one's immune to this.
Mm-mm.
And um that's the thing about betrayal. It's just it's a betrayal. It's not a plan. It's not like you're consciously sabotaging yourself. It's like you're making the very best decisions with someone who seems to be making their very best decisions. You come to an agreement, you build a life, and then for whatever reason, the carpet gets ripped out from underneath you and you fall. And you just fall. And sometimes you fall for a long time and you don't know what to grab onto or how to get to the bottom of it. And that falling is so destabilizing. It is a whole issue unto itself. But you can't fall if you don't trust. And that means that every trust could potentially have a fall. It just is what it is.
Yes. Do you feel like you're in the rebirth phase right now, or where do you feel like you are in this process?
I feel like I'm in the selfish bitch phase. Like, like I'm like in the phase where um I essentially feel like I saved my own life, or the grace of God saved my life, the divine feminine saved my life. I don't know. I feel like my life has been saved. I feel like I'm just so grateful for that the life that I was ultimately going to live had this fall never happened isn't nearly as peaceful, frankly, as the life I have now. It looks really different, but I have peace. So I'm operating at from like a fundamental place of peace. And it's a deeper peace. It's a more profound peace. I think it's a peace we get to through our psychological, emotional, spiritual journey as we go through life, God willing. Um, anyway, but like like on the other side of this grief, it just feels like such a deep nourishment. And so I'm at the point in my life where I'm like, rebirth sounds like a lot of work. Um, I do think I'm probably rebirthing for sure, but I'm also like, I just kind of want to n- nurture where I am right now because this feels like such an arrival, but it's not big. It's not flashy. It's not like, like look at my bounce back me. It's so quiet. One of the things I went through in the aftermath of all this was I had to learn the concept of gray rocking, which are you familiar with that term?
I am.
Yes. So just like learning how to go gray so that you're not people whom which are looking for pizzazz just don't find you interesting and they go somewhere else. And so I've gone gray um, in many areas and aspects of my life. And I've just kept me for me. And it is the, I don't know, like I don't have words to describe it, but it is pretty freaking awesome. And so when you say rebirth, I'm like, that feels like a me for others. And I'm just not there. So I'm like, I think I'm in the selfish bitch phase.
Yeah. I mean, I see how this feels for you, but I invite you to reframe rebirth because I think that that's how it's can be glorified, but
Mhm.
it's not necessarily work. Like it's an energy that comes up in through us
Mhm.
that is ours. It's for us.
Yeah, well, then I'm in that. I think
Yeah.
I'm in a
It's
pure.
like yeah, it's like all the sifting and all the like all the letting go and all the things that you've done. And there's what are the words? There's just like new openings inside or
It is.
new like a meeting yourself in new ways.
It's a piece I've never known before. I
Like a
will.
homecoming, a homecoming.
It is a homecoming. It's a piece I've never known before. It's an okayness that
Yes.
is just a new bedrock of my existence. It is, there's a pride. There's like a deep pride around like, not an ego pride, but like a deep pride, like, oh, I can basically handle anything at this point. But it's private. And I think that's where when I maybe perhaps trying to articulate, it's just so personal. It's completely not flashy. Um, and it's quiet. It's just a deep, quiet power. Um, and a lot of it is like, I feel like I'm going back to who I was when I was like 3 or 4, like the gentleness of my soul, the quiet curiosity, the deep enjoyment of my individual playtime, just my hobbies, my habits, my routine, my spiritual practices. They're so free, but so aligned and so easy. Like everything, it just feels easy right now for me to be me, not like me to be me as a business owner or me to be me in other dynamics in my life, but just deep ease in my life when no one is looking. And I really appreciate that.
Feels like a good note to end on. I so acknowledge you for this journey that you've been on. And thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing something that's so deeply private with us. I know that I'm just really holding your story and you very tenderly, and I know all our listeners are too, and using this as just learning and wisdom sourcing for all of our journeys.
And right back at you, there's been many moments where I know that we exchange emails every now and again as we read each other's newsletters and like, we're in touch with each other. But there have been many moments in this journey where you have come to my mind um, as a reference point. And so I just want to say thank you to you. I can't wait to read this book. Um, so thank you for this forthcoming book, but just thank you. Thank you for having always been brave in sharing your story and transparent in the ways that you've have been and continue to be, because I think it's really you go to areas and stories that are edgy and, for some dangerous, I think. And that to me, if you didn't do what you do and you weren't one of the like 3 or 4 deep stories I could reference in my own mind as I was going through this, I would feel that much more alone, that much more isolated, and that much more without a lighthouse. And so I just want to say thank you to you because you've always have been here on the edge and you've been with me. You've been a part of my like inner choir in terms of voices and stories I can hold as a reference point as I went through this. And so it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to support your book, and I'm pumped to read it.
Thank you so much. That means a lot. So we'll share the link to your website, which people readers can find your book and your ways to work with you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we close?
No, just a
Okay.
big dose of gratitude and love.
Yeah, and sending that back to you.